And I think you probably heard me. Please don't take notes, just listen. All of this will be available for you. So let's get right to it. This is a report of the survey results from Poland done in September, out of the field in September, about 900 sample points. This is a strategic analysis. I'm not going to go question by question. I'm trying to give you the context to learn how to communicate better in Poland and who you're talking to and who you need to talk to. I think you saw this slide. The poll starts with demography, as most polls do, but then it goes into a different place than most polls that you've seen and hear about on the news or have consumed before. It goes and looks at worldviews. And these worldviews are how people view the world, and the sieve through which, or the filter through which, they see issues, actions, policy. So hostile sexism, populism, authoritarianism, ideology, and this thing called EU segmentation, which you're about to learn a lot more about. And not to steal the thunder of the presentation, but the EU segmentation that we are using here is very, very powerful, especially when it's combined with authoritarianism. You're saying, what is that? You're going to learn in a sec. What else does the poll look at? It looks at basic values, pride in being Polish, social cohesion, how you feel about democracy, tolerance, order, traditions, whole range of values that very few polls really get into. And then it gets to the place where most polls start, and those are issues. How do people feel about immigration? How do they feel about climate change? How do they feel about choice and women's rights? The things that you all deal with every day, LGBTQ issues, how do they feel about it? Well, we know that there's a lot of debate on that in Poland. These issues get filtered through all these other worldviews, values, and demography, and allows us to really get a very granular understanding of people in Poland. And that granular understanding is important because we can apply it to communications. And there's one other thing we add in this poll that you don't see many other places, and that's reverse engineering questions. You're going to say, what are those? Well, many of your colleagues offered 14 questions. These are questions that allow us to bridge the poll to communications very directly using internet tools. So these are questions you hardly ever see in a poll. There were 14 of them. 6 of them really sort Poland well in terms of Polish civil society and Polish people well in terms of communications. So those reverse engineering questions are just questions that allow us to bridge from all this data to communications better. So the key in this presentation, I'm going to present a lot of data. But I'm going to sum it up into a segmentation and targeting that you can use today when you walk out the door, and framing and messaging that you can use today when this is over in your communications. The focus of the framing and messaging is EU, European Union, support, but you can also use it for support for civil society issues, no matter what that issue is. It can be choice, it could be LGBTQ, human rights, immigration, you name it, you can use it. So that's the key. We've got to go through some data to get there. So first, I love polling. I love asking questions. So I want to ask you 4 questions, everyone on the phone or on getting this presentation. And these are yes or no questions that say yes or no in your brain. First question. A democratic political system is a very good or fairly good way of governing my country. Yes or no? Second question. Democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. Yes or no? And these questions, or versions of them, were asked of the people in the poll, just so you know. So you're replicating what they did. Next question, and watch how this is worded. Army rule is a bad or very bad way of governing my country. Yes or no? Notice it's reversed. The question's reversed. That's so that we avoid bias in the answers. So army rule is a bad or very bad way of governing my country. My answer would be, yeah, army rule is a bad way of governing my country. And the last question, having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections is a bad or very bad way of governing my country. Strong leader, doesn't bother with parliament or elections, bad or very bad way of governing my country, yes or no? Now, if you said yes to all four of these questions, you are a consistent supporter of democracy. And I would wager a bet, and I don't bet often, but I would wager a bet that most of the people on this call or on this receiving this presentation said yes to all four of those questions, and that our number is probably 75 to 80, 85%. That's typical to people who care about civil society and work on the issues that we all work on. So the key question then is, if we're at 75, 80%, let's say, what percent of Polish citizens from the survey always support democracy like we do? And the answer to that question is 29% of Polish citizens always support democracy. And what you see here is a gigantic gap between who we are and what our worldviews are. I mean, we're all people, but our worldviews, which is supportive of democracy and liberal democracy and civil society, and Polish citizens as a whole, is almost a 50, probably close to a 50 percentage point difference. That's an important gap. And that's a gap that affects our communications, how we communicate, what we say, who we say it to, what we assume about our audience. If we assume that our audience is all big supporters of democracy, we are wrong, because only 29% of those of Polish citizens are. So this is a graph graphing this information. And you're going to see a lot of graphs like this throughout the rest of this presentation. And they're all going to follow this standard format. Percent of populations on the vertical, you can see 10%, 20%, 30%, percent of population, Polish population. And on the horizontal is a scale. This scale is totally consistent to totally inconsistent supporter of democracy. Blue bars are always the civil society, pro-democracy, pro-EU attitudes. Yellow is in the middle or heading towards the orange, and red, which is illiberal democracy supporters. So it will always be like this. Any graph you see from now on, blue is, think of our base or persuadables, yellow to red, opposition. And as you can see, there's the inconsistent bar. Who are those people? Where did they fall out? Well, they fell out on this question. Having a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or national elections is a good way to govern Poland. Most people said, no, that's, most people would be for a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or national elections. That's where most of the people went from being totally consistent to inconsistent supporters of democracy. That was the question. So how does this compare to other European countries? Well, this is 2019 data and 13 European countries. And you can see Denmark to Germany is above 50% are total consistent supporters of democracy. Spain to Estonia is 30 to 43% of the population in those countries consistently support democracy. And Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria were in the third cohort. And at that time, in 2019, only 19% of Poland tested as a consistent supporter of democracy. And it's gone up 10 points in between. It's the only country that we've tested where consistent support of democracy has gone up. What's gone down? Support for the strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or national elections. That means that yellow bar was a lot higher in earlier polls, and the blue bar, the totally consistent, was a lot lower. So there's been real progress there. Many other things we've looked at in Poland, many other values and worldviews are stable. This one, not. This one, a marked movement towards consistent support for democracy, which is very positive, 2019 to 2021. So who supports democracy and who's inconsistent supporter of democracy? And what we're doing is taking worldviews and demography and mapping it on top of this support for democracy set of bars that we have. And what we find, it's very straightforward. These are regression analysis, so they're statistically significant. It's the only time I'm going to say that. We have not authoritarians, not hostile sexists, populists, very important, never attend church, higher educational attainment, and older are more likely to be totally consistent supporters of democracy. They're in that 29% bar, are much more likely to be. All their opposites, authoritarians, etc., are more likely to be inconsistent supporters of democracy. And one of the key groups there is younger folks. We do see this in every country, that the younger you are, the less likely you are to be a consistent supporter of democracy. And that's a real problem for democracy. All right, well, that's kind of interesting. And one of the most important things here is that this can help us with communications, but watch the populist as we go through this presentation. The populists are sometimes with the authoritarians, sometimes they're not. And they're people who are very important to us in terms of winning support for issues we care about. What else can we know about this support for democracy? Well, we can apply these EU seg1s. These are the EU segmentations, which we'll talk about more in a second. What are these things? Well, first of all, know that people who fit into EU segment 1 are much more likely to be total consistent supporters of democracy, where the EU segment 4 people, they're much more likely to be inconsistent supporters of democracy. So how does Poland segment in terms of the EU segmentation? This is based on 3 questions. We've asked them now in 8 countries. They're highly predictive of support for EU and civil society and liberal democracy. And here's how Poland segments out. 37% in the blue, the dark blue, 29, light blue, 13, 22. And remember what I said earlier, the blue bars represent civil society support bars, yellow and red, those are the opposition. And what you're going to find is, unlike every other country, this blue bar, the 29% segment 2, it's really a divided segment. The split really occurs there in Poland more than in segment 3, and you'll see that in a second. But let's dig a little bit more deeply into this. What do we call these bars? Well, the blue bar, segment 1, those are EU enthusiasts. These people are all in on the EU. They love it. Segment 2, according to the segmentation, are moderates. Again, they're really split. You'll see why in a minute. The ambivalents are mostly against us, and the skeptics are really against us when it comes to EU, but it also maps into authoritarianism, democracy, just about every other thing we care about. Women's rights, human rights, LGBTQ issues, you name it, they're against it. And you can really think of these as base audience. That 37% is the strong base for EU and things we care about. Persuadables, about half of those moderates, that 29% of Polish society, is gettable for us, but not much more than half. The ambivalents, their opposition, if we are lucky, we'd pick up 1 out of every 4 of them. And the skeptics, you can just forget about the skeptics. They're authoritarians, they're hostile sexists, they don't like us. They don't like what we care about, and we're not going to be able to get them to. All right, what else? We can apply on top of this worldview and a whole range of other demographics on these segments. And what we find is what you would expect. Consistent supporters of democracy are segment 1, not authoritarian, not hostile sexist, ideologically on the left, not populist, and older are all segment 1. But I want you to look at the populist. Remember, populists were with us on democracy issues. They're now with the authoritarians and the hostile sexists when it comes to the EU segmentation, which means they're really an up for grab audience for us, very important audience for us. Let's keep going here. What we find looking at all these questions, EU segmentations, democracy, and a whole range of others, is that there are 10 variables, 10 variables that shape political choices, attitudes, and identity in Poland. And these are statistically significant in how they shape those attitudes and political choices. And what are those? First, it's worldview. Authoritarians, hostile sexism, populism, and your basic ideology shapes your political choices in ways that are meaningful politically. Age, education, church attendance, and gender demographics also shape those. And then finally, support for democracy, as we've gone through, and support for the EU segments, also shape or reflect political choices, attitudes, and identity. And so these 10 variables allow us to sort the Polish population for messaging and targeting and segmenting. They're very, very, very powerful. So I don't expect you to believe this. So I'm going to prove it to you, or try to prove it to you through a few examples. First, let's look at political choices. This is the presidential vote in Poland. This is what the people in our survey reported how they voted in the presidential election. So this is their remembered vote in the presidential election. And you can see it came up 49% for Civic Platform, 51% for the PIS. All right, that's interesting. Can we map those divides we just talked about on top of this? Yes, we can. Civic Platform people were more likely to be not authoritarian, not hostile, sexist, ideologically in the left, consistent supporters of democracy. They never attend church, and they have higher educational attainment. And the PIS, the exact opposite of it. And you're going to see this over and over again. Notice populism's not on here. It was not statistically significant in the vote choice on the presidential vote. We can also look at this presidential vote. Again, this is remembered presidential vote by EU segments, and that is very telling in terms of targeting. EU segment 1, 75% of people in the EU segment 1 supported Civic Platform. Only 25% supported PIS. EU segment 2, this is why I say it's contested. It was split, 49-51. EU segment 3, you can see 25-75, and EU segment 4, they almost were all PIS. So one of the keys is that 25% in the EU segment 1 who voted for PIS, who are they? Because they say the questions indicate they're strong supporters of the EU, but they're voting for PIS. Why? You're going to find they're authoritarian, they're hostile, sexist. They're hard to get at. The EU segment 2, those 49%, those are key persuasion audience for us, as are some of the ones who voted for the PIS. Now, how close was this to reality? Well, here is the raw data from the poll, 48% for PIS, 46.2% for Civic Platform. You get rid of the not sure, don't know, get you the 51-49. The election, I believe, was 51-49, so it's really spot on. So the poll was very good at capturing presidential vote, which should lend some credibility also to this segmentation that we're looking at. All right, so political choices seem to be fairly well structured by segmentation, worldviews, and demography. What about attitudes? Here's an attitude: democratic practice, support for free press, independent judiciary, right to protest. Pretty key things in Poland right now, especially independent judiciary and right to protest. Think of Black Monday. The blue bars here are very important. So almost 80% of Polish citizens say free press is very important. Almost 80% say independent judiciary. Yeah, we'd like to have it back. You can see lower number, just over 60% right to protest. We can map on, again, these variables and see that they're really consistent in terms of democratic practice. For example, if you're a consistent supporter of democracy, you're more likely to say free press is really important. Independent judiciary, really important. Right to protest, really important. But notice who, and the authoritarians, they say it's not important, not important, not important. But also look who travels with these consistent supporters of democracies. On independent judiciary, populists think it's very, very important. So we can get populists to side with us on issues having to do with the independence of the Polish judiciary. Very, very important. We also know that they're consistent supporters of democracy, very, very important. In right to protest, you have the people who are pathologically attend church. They're more likely to say the right to protest is not as important. I bet that's an outcome of the Black Monday protest, but I'm just spitballing there. What else? We can also look at these democratic practices by EU segmentation. And you can see the EU segmentation is how powerful it is. 90% of EU segment 1 support a free press. See how much greater that is than the average population. And 39% of EU segment 4 say free press is not as important. And run all over to the right to protest, 52% of EU segment 4 says that the right to protest is not that important in Poland. So you can see these EU segmentations map onto a whole range of different things and allow us to really understand Poland much, much better. Let's look now also at institutional trust. Here's another attitude. Do our segments work there? Do our worldviews and other variables help us understand those? Well, this is trust in Polish government and trust in the European Union. And you can see that trust in the Polish government is just, high trust is just over 20%, where high trust in the European Union is almost at 40%. We don't see that very often. Polish citizens, to put this in English, are much more likely to trust the European Union than they are their own government. Who are these people? Well, you can look at it by EU segmentation. When you look at this, it really starts to make sense. People in EU segment 1, remember, they're big supporters of the EU. Their trust in the Polish government's just 17%. Whereas EU segment 4, they hate the EU. They have much more trust in the Polish government. The flip side, over here, trust in the European Union, 74% of EU segment 1 people trust the European Union, only 4%. And the margin of error on that number means it's from 0 to probably 8 or 9. In EU segment 4, I have high trust for the European Union. So you can see trust is also reflected in EU segmentation. Trust of national government, trust of European Union. Attitudes to change are also reflected in the EU segmentation. And I could put in authoritarianism, hostile sexism. I could go over those same variables. I'm not going to do that because it would take hours to get through this. But just realize that when EU segmentation is showing differences, so is authoritarianism, hostile sexism, populism, and others. So attitudes to change. 52% of polls, this is pretty even, 52-48, 52% say Poland's better off if it's open to changes regarding traditions. 48% say, oh, we'll be better off in Poland if we stick to traditions. Look at the difference here between the EU segmentation. 72% of EU segment 1 says, hey, we got to be open to changes regarding traditions. 75% say, hey, we got to stick to traditions of EU segment 4. That's a gigantic polarization, a gigantic divide in Polish society. We can look at change another way too. We can look at it this way. And the question is there a contradiction here? The first question we already talked about, 52-48, 52% saying open to changes regarding traditions. The next question is a little bit different look at change. And the first 56% say it's too risky to support political parties with radical ideas for change, where 44% of polls chose electing political parties with radical ideas is how we get real change. Is there a contradiction here? And you would look at it and say, yeah, there's a contradiction. There's a problem with the poll here, but here's how you can explain it. First of all, you can explain it by looking at EU segmentations. And we saw that big divide on the first question. There's a significant divide also on the second question. EU segment 1 is more likely to say, you know, when it comes to parties with radical ideas for change, that's too risky for Poland. Whereas EU segment 4 says, hey, we want radical ideas. That's how we get real change. But how do we explain that still? Well, here's how you explain it. EU segment 1, those are people who are strong supporters of the EU and civil society, are open to changing traditions, but not change based on radical ideas and change that takes us back to the past. They do not want to return to the past. They want change for the future. Whereas EU4 is more open to radical political change, but they want change that reinstates the traditions they support. They want radical political change to bring you back to return to the status quo past. And that is an important difference that is critical to how you communicate. Right, let's keep going. EU segment 4, radical political change that reinstates, reaffirms traditions. If you're not afraid of that, you will be. And I'm sure you are, actually. Because that radical political change, a strong leader making decisions, not paying attention to the judiciary, hollowing out the judiciary, that is what they're all about. All right. You can also see this, as I said, these variables in self-identification. We ask people, how do you identify? Polish only, Polish and European, European and Polish, European only, don't know. You can see the distribution here. A third say Polish only. 41% say, I'm Polish and European. Another 15 European and Polish. How do the segments map onto this? Well, it's very telling. EU segment 4, 54% of them, a majority, say I'm Polish only. Whereas 47%, a plurality of EU segment 1 says I'm Polish and European. So identity is shaped or reflects these different worldviews and this segmentation too. Critical to know for communication. That 21% of EU segment 1 who say they're Polish only, those are the people who also voted for the PIS in large part. It's statistically significant. That is why they're probably going to be hard to get, even though they're in EU segment 1. They're worth working, but they're going to be hard to get. What else can we know about this? Well, our base support in EU segment 1 comes from people who are Polish and European, European and Polish, European only. Persuasion target, those are going to be a hard one in EU segment 1, is at 21% who are Polish only. And there are ways that we can persuade them. I'll get to it at the very end of this. And the opposition folks, EU segment 4, Polish only and Polish European, they're impossible to get to. That's 84% of that the EU skeptics. You're not going to get them ever. You can also look at this in terms of EU segment 2. There are lots of different ways to cut this. You see there's a really good persuasion audience in EU segment 2. Those are the people who identify as Polish and European. And then you've got your base support over there, European and Polish. So these variables all help us understand where people are in Poland and how to segment and target them. And I'll get to that in just a second. I just want to go through quickly some feelings about Poland and some feelings about the European Union. Sometimes I feel like a stranger in my own country. You can see a majority. Agree is the red bar here. Disagree is the blue bar. Why? Because we don't want people feeling like they're a stranger in their country. A majority, small, but a majority, agree that they feel like a stranger in their own country. And here you can see that EU segment 1 and EU segment 4 are very similar. So the basic feeling for a lot of people, majority of people in Poland, that they feel like they're a stranger in their own country for different reasons, for sure, EU segment 1 and EU segment 4, but that feeling of alienation is there. And that's critical, all right? Economic inequality is growing. Look at those numbers. A majority, strong majority, almost over 70% say economic inequality is growing in Poland. So first, I feel alienated. Second, I feel that inequality, economic, is growing in Poland. And look at the EU segment numbers on that. Everyone above 50%, EU segments 1, 2, and 4, above 2/3 of the people in those different segments saying economic inequality is growing. And then finally, Look at where our populists are. They're in there too. They say economic inequality is growing. So we've got alienation. We've got a feeling that economic inequality is growing. That is held across Polish society, and also populist in terms of economic inequality. And then look at this number. The world is an increasingly dangerous place. And look at the segments. Over 70% of all segments agree that the world is an increasingly dangerous place. So they feel alienated, generally, people in Poland, from their country for different reasons, but they do. There's economic inequality, and they think the world's a dangerous place. They're scared. And it's across all segments. This is a storm warning. Again, see, our populists are there too. It's a storm warning for our messaging. So the solution generally, when you're that scared and that alienated, that worried about economic inequality, is we need a strong leader who's willing to break the rules. But as you can see, this is the agree to disagree to agree on that. It's pretty even across Polish society, whether we agree that we need a strong leader or we disagree. And as you'll note, that strong leader choice has gone down over the last 3 years. So even though there's fear and alienation, the choice of a strong leader is weakening in Polish society. And you can see there's an inverse here in terms of EU segment 1 and EU segment 4. EU segment 1, much more likely to disagree that we need a strong leader. EU segment 4, much more likely to agree that we need a strong leader to lead Poland, solve alienation, solve economic inequality, protect us because the world's a dangerous place to be. This difference is key. And then here I overlaid the worldviews and some demographics that are statistically significant on this question. And I have a green arrow pointing to women. Notice that women are more likely to be to disagree that we need a strong leader, and men are more likely to agree. That's where we see a big gender difference. And I can assure you that you know the reasons why that is occurring. So let's do the EU for 5 minutes, and then I'll sum this all up in something you can use. Is Poland on the right track or wrong track? You can see most people, 60%, say Poland's on the wrong track. Only 30% say the right track. In terms of the European Union, a little bit higher percentage say the EU is on the right track, lower percentage say the EU is on the wrong track. And then if you look in terms of segmentation, you can see the EU segments again showing an inverse. Most EU segment 1 say the European Union's on the right track. Only 3% of EU segment 4 say the European Union's on the right track. And then even in EU segment 2, you see a third say European Union's on the right track. Those are persuadables who we can get to support us. We would have to go after the people who are the 42% say wrong track. What other views of the European Union? Well, there's some really key ones. First, this is what Poles want the EU to do. They want the EU to improve the public health system, reduce poverty and social inequality, and take action against climate change. But climate change is low on this list compared to the economic things. Public health, an economic and health issue. Inequality, obviously an economic issue. So they want the EU to work on these things. And why is it important to remain in the EU? For every country, freedom to study, live, work, and travel is the top reason to remain in the EU. It's important to look at the other ones. They want the EU to improve the prosperity and security of Poland. That's danger. That's threat. They want the EU, and they think the reason to remain in the EU is it improves prosperity and security. And they want the EU to invest, like the EU and staying in the EU, because it invests in less affluent members to raise the standard of living. Again, another economic issue. And then down fourth, protecting democracy, freedom, and human rights. So it's danger first. EU improves our prosperity and security. That's danger in economy. It's investment second, which is all economy, and then protecting democracy and freedom. So we need to be talking about prosperity. We need to be talking about economy. standard of living. That's why that's why Poland needs to remain in the EU. Okay, attitudes towards solidarity. These numbers are amazing. 73 to 27 people believe we should do everything we can to help other EU countries in need. Only 27% say, hey, solidarity is too far, gone too far. Who are those people? EU segment 3 and up chooses do everything we can to help other EU countries in need. Only EU segment 4 falls below 50%, with 57% saying demands for solidarity are being pushed too far. So EU solidarity is a good thing to talk about. Attitudes or disagreements between members of EU states are a healthy part of the democratic process. 61% of polls agree to that, and 60% and 76% of EU segments 1 and 2 agree with that. So disagreements, that's just part of democracy. Attitudes towards EU, another one. I want, when EU leaders disagree, okay, it's okay for them to disagree. I want decisions based on what's best for the EU as a whole. 62% of polls agree with that. 38% take the nationalist perspective. I always want my country's position to prevail. Look at this by segmentations. EU segments 1 and 2 are all about EU decisions for as a whole should prevail. The nationalist perspective by EU segment 3 and EU segment 4, which is why it's going to be hard to get those people. And then finally, attitudes towards EU. EU is a threat to Poland's sovereignty. 52% of polls disagree with this. 24% agree. Those are the real EU skeptics. You'll see that here the EU segmentation. EU segments 1 and 2 say, you know, EU is not a threat to Poland's sovereignty. EU segment 3 is not really sure, 53%, really not sure if they are or not. And the EU segment 1, 54% say, yeah, they're a problem. It's a threat to sovereignty. Efforts to help reduce COVID. Has the EU's efforts helped reduce COVID? 69% of polls say yes, it's helped reduce it. Only 31% have said no. You're going to see again, EU segments 1, 2, and here 3 are saying, yeah, EU has helped us reduce the effects of COVID. Attitudes towards the EU's in terms of what does COVID show us about the EU? COVID shows we need a strong EU that works efficiently for all members. 57% agree with this, 22% agree. And again, you can see these segmentations, how this just plays out throughout all of this data. And then finally, the EU Recovery Fund. Look at the strong support for the EU Recovery Fund. And it makes sense when we know what they want. They want the EU to help less affluent countries. They want the EU to help with prosperity and security. And the European Recovery Fund is part of that. Very strong support for that. That support goes across 3 of the 4 segments, 76% of EU segment 3. And these are people who are ambivalent about the EU, like the European Recovery Fund. And you can see the EORs, we would call them, in the mix, EU segment 4, even 48% of them like the EU Recovery Fund. All right, so how are you going to apply this? I'm going to tie this all up in the next 8 minutes. And this is the key. I hope that I've proven to you there's the divide in Poland. I think you know that it's polarized, that the divide operates on very specific lines that we can identify. And now I'm going to show you we can use those lines, use those variables to target communications. So here are 4 segments. And we can apply on top of those segments, these are the same segments, top line variables. So we know that EU segment 1 supporters and many EU segment 2 are consistent supporters of democracies or more likely to support democracy. They're not authoritarians, they're not hostile sexists, they're ideologically on the left. And we know also that populists really go back and forth across this segmentation. So we can take these top line variables and we can find authoritarians, we can find hostile sexists, and we can find supporters of democracy online on Facebook, for example, or Instagram today. right? But that's not all. We have demographics too. We know that higher educational attainment, older when it comes to consistency with democracy, younger when it comes to climate change and the presidential vote for civic platform, women and those who never attend church are more likely to be in our base or persuadables, whereas their exact opposite in terms of demographics aren't. Again, we can apply this online along with the top line variables. We can add identity. People who consider themselves to be Polish and European are going to be much more likely in EU segment 1. Polish only, they're EU segment 3 or 4 mostly. And they're going to be hard for us to win over. There's 21% of them that are in EU segment 1. And there, if we picked up 1 out of every 4 of them, we would be lucky. They're worth going after, but it's going to be hard. What else? Attitudes and concerns. All of these things on these charts you can take and apply to targeting, certainly on Facebook and Instagram right away. But party choice, democracy, climate, women's rights, gay rights, immigration, all of these issues, attitudes, and concerns are reflected in the EU segments. What does that mean? Well, let's focus on one, climate. Climate change, serious problem. I can find those people by pulling up Greenpeace members or people who are interested in Poland. Younger people especially, they're going to be EU segment 1 or EU segment 2. Climate change, not as much a problem. They're going to be in EU segment 3, EU segment 4. So you can use all of these to target your advertising, your communications, your messaging in Poland. And you can add in those reverse engineering questions. And here are the 6 that work. And they're going to make absolute sense to you. But there are 8 that didn't work, which would have made absolute sense to you too. These are the ones that work. If you like military parades, you are EU segment 4. If you don't own a gun, you're EU segment 1. If you own a gun, you're EU segment 4. If you like the bike to work, you are EU segment 1 or 2. If you think the Smolensk tragedy was caused by bad weather, you're EU segment 1 or 2. I think that's obvious. If you think gender studies is science, you're EU segment 1 or 2. And if you support gay teachers in the classrooms, you're EU segment 1 or 2. So you can use all those different variables to target EU segments 1, and especially in the EU segment 2. We need to pick up 1 out of every 2 of those people. We know it's split. You can use these to burrow in and really figure out who those people are. I'm going to skip over this to get to frame because I'm late. So that was the segmentation and targeting. How do we frame? What are you saying to these people? Well, I know you want to talk about your issue, but how do you situate your issue? What do you put it in? What's the vessel that carries it? Well, first, the identity. It always has to be Polish first, European second. You can't talk about Europe first, Europe first. You have to do Polish first, European second, together, stronger. The emotions, hope for a better future. Hope is the key here. Remember, there's a real fear of danger. It's got to be about hope. There has to be great pride in Poland in your communications. I saw one pro-EU march that had about 50% Polish flags, 50% EU flags. The perception of people in focus groups were there need to be more Polish flags there. They didn't mind the EU flags, but they wanted more Polish flags. You got to show pride, and you can do it with a flag. You have to be future oriented. And this gets to the change question, open to change regarding traditions to build a stronger future for Poland. This is not radical change, and it's not change that takes us back to the status quo, the patriarchy. And the goal is key, a future where economic inequality is lessened, security of Poland is protected and enhanced, and democracy too, okay? But you lead with economic inequality, lessen the economic issues. You lead with security. And democracy follows with that. That's part of it. But you've got to lead with these other things. And this comes right back from the EU's place. They want, in the green, the EU to improve the public health system, to reduce poverty and social inequality, to improve the prosperity and security of Poland. and to invest in less affluent members to raise the standard of living. And democracy and climate change are secondary. Not that they aren't important with key groups, especially climate change with younger, but they are still secondary. So how do you apply and use this today? You talk about strength in EU solidarity, not going it alone, going it together. Poland and EU, not EU and Poland. It's going to make Poland economically stronger, make Poland more secure. Economic growth can help resolve economic inequality. And with the base audience, you can talk about protecting and promoting democracy. And there are direct benefits. They think, polls think, majority of them, EU segment 3, 1, and 2, the European Recovery Fund is good for Poland. It's going to help us recover faster economically and promote economic social equality. And they realize that COVID-19 efforts helped reduce effects. It wasn't perfect. If you say it's perfect, forget about it, but it helped. And the EU response to COVID, the solidarity in the response, the working together in that response, again, it wasn't perfect, but it's an example of why the EU is important. But you have to acknowledge through all this, EU is not perfect. It's a work in progress. With our base audiences, yes, it promotes and protects democracy. That's key. We have to do that. Democracy is under assault in Poland right now. But we have these other things too that it does that are really important to us, and that's economics and others. So that's the presentation. I am more than happy to take questions. I know we're short on time. The presentation, I am more than happy to, that's the presentation. I am more than happy to